Today is February 25th, 2024. This is episode 40 of the In a Nutshell podcast. I'm your host, Sean Vowells. That's my man, Joe Meade. Tonight, Joe Meade and I will go over a couple of football topics before getting into a ton of questions about the long-term future of some of the basketball teams in the Big Ten. So, Joe, as usual, why don't you take it away with some football first?
Yeah, I think, it's been, again, a pretty dead period. I was actually going to try to field some questions today, but I think today's focus could be basketball. With that said, Sean, the biggest piece of news has been Eric Bieniemy, hired as the associate head coach and offensive coordinator for UCLA. I'm going to imagine that he's going to be controlling the play calling and person in that organization.
Yeah, there's a little issues there, Joe, but I think we're okay now.
All right, Sean, I'm back.
Yeah, you never left.
Okay,
but,
perfect. Yeah, no.
Well,
Sweet. Awesome. No, sorry about the pause, everyone, but Eric Bieniemy, I think it's pretty ironic because it's the kind of reversal of roles. You had Chip Kelly begging to get out of UCLA. We had Jeff Hapley at Boston College, albeit outside the Big Ten, begging to get out of being a head coach. So it's kind of nice for a change. Eric Bieniemy, you have to assume he had no shortage of options in the NFL. Perhaps not as definitely not as a head coach, but probably as a position coach, passing coordinator of some sorts. Like, if he wanted to be employed in the NFL, he would be right now. But perhaps giving college a chance. If you put a gun to my head, I guarantee you he wants to be back in the NFL when all is said and done. But it's kind of a nice change, Sean. After a month of all these guys just begging to leave college. So I think this opens UCLA's offense up a lot. Hypothetically, had Dante Moore stayed there, this would have been more interesting to me. But we'll see. Since he's been hired, so I think this maximizes them even higher. But I don't think it's really changed the fact that they'll probably be the 6th to 10th best team in this conference year one. So, Sean, that's pretty much it for football news. We could get it.
all right, Joe, you cut out just a little bit at the end there, but I think you were just wrapping it up.
Yep.
Not sure why the YouTube is not going through right now. Hang in there with us. All right, it's already looking a little better here. And all right, it says it's a little better. And we got green bars. But Bieniemy, everyone knows he was the offensive coordinator for the Chiefs for a while. Didn't call plays. Took the OC job in Washington so that he could call plays, and unfortunately his head coach was fired, so he found himself out of a job. Now, Joe, I think I have to agree with you. I don't think his stay in college will be long. Might just be this season, but it's always good to get somebody with that much experience in the door at a program that is going to be learning the new conference, just like everybody's going to be learning the new conference, not just him there. But Joe, we had a ton go on over the last week in college hoops. In just a couple of days, the calendar will turn to March. We'll talk about some results that happened, but mostly focus on what these teams can do in March and maybe even beyond it into future seasons. So first, Joe, we're going to talk about the game that went down on Tuesday, I believe. No, Wednesday. Penn State hosts the first conference game in our lifetime at Rec Hall. We talked about it last week. They get the job done over Illinois, 90-89. The Fighting Illini were up by 7 with 49 seconds to go, but they turned the ball over and missed free throws, and Penn State steals a victory here. Joe, what were your thoughts on this one before we go into the long-term season of the Nittany Lions?
Terrence Shannon was absolutely phenomenal in this game. If you look at Illinois' stat line, you had him with 35, Domask with 15. You had 19 points off the bench. It's hard to imagine, and 89 points. Hard to imagine how they would have lost the game in regulation that way, and they managed to. That collapse at the end was almost inexplicable. It was probably as bad as Michigan State's collapse against Iowa last year around this time, where they led by like 14 or something with like 130. So, in fairness to Michigan State of last year, that was to a really good Iowa team that made the tournament. Penn State's a sub-500 team, so for Illinois to do this, and practically that ruined their any hope at a share of a conference title. I think that's really bad. Does it ruin everything they've gone through this season? Definitely not. They're still going to be a protected seed as it stands right now, but certainly push them closer to the brink of that than they probably needed. But Shaw, what were your thoughts?
Just they don't have a point guard, and they never have, and they're not going to get one on February 25th. And just inbounding the ball, 18 turnovers, 9 missed free throws. That is how you get upset in the tournament. They're going to be a 4 seed. They're still a protected seed, but these 13 seeds this year are going to be good. I'm going to be picking the upset at least in a couple of my brackets, because that showed that despite having the best player on the floor and despite being the better team, that they can lose a game, and that is not a good sign. We've talked about Brad Underwood and Illinois' lack of success in March in the past, and Joe, unfortunately, if that happens again this year, I don't think I would be surprised. Now, I think Penn State has surprised us in how competitive they've been in Mike Rhodes' first year with pretty much an entire new roster. He loses his best player. He dismisses his best player from the program, and they win a couple ball games. So I think the future is looking bright for Penn State, but this cannot happen for Illinois. You can't give away a game like that. It's just, you're up 7 with 45 seconds left. I mean, you take that position as a road team every single time in this conference, and they don't get the job done from there. Joe, but they did bounce back with a 10-point victory against Iowa yesterday. Coleman Hawkins had a terrific game with 30 points, and they temporarily burst the bubble of Iowa. Wasn't really getting very close, but some bracketologists had them in the first 4 out, which is pretty crazy. That's no longer a thing, but here's what happened in the Iowa game, Joe. Nico Moretti, 6'1" point guard from Italy, got 19 minutes. I think that at least had to do something with the collapse that we saw at Rec Hall on Wednesday.
Yeah, Sean, and I think, I'm not trying to be Mr. Doom and Gloom here for Illinois. Giving up practically almost 90 points, 90 in one, and almost 90 in the other, 2 straight games. Is that a disturbing trend, or you think that's just we're being a victim of the moment here?
I don't think they're very good at defense, Joe. I think it is a long-term issue that, they are 4th in offensive efficiency, and their lack of positions does help them on the offensive end. Not many 5s are going to be able to step out and cover Coleman Hawkins when he's in there, but, Joe, they're 61st in defense, and that is, the worst, the second worst, third worst in the top 20 here behind just Alabama and Baylor. But I think it's a trend that hasn't just lasted these 2 games, Joe. I think that you get some of these, 12, 13 seeds, the Indiana States, the Appalachian States, with high-ranked offenses, I think they might get exposed.
Yeah, that's the biggest thing I took away, which is if they don't play the way they have the last 2 games offensively, and particularly last night against Iowa, because, as you said, they could not have, they fired at all cylinders. Sure, Iowa's defense is probably even worse. Point is, Sean, if they don't get that fixed, and they probably won't, it's the end of February, they're probably going to be one of the most popular upset picks. And if it doesn't happen in the 4-13 game, I bet you people will pick them in the 5-4 game to lose.
Joe, they, as you pointed out earlier in this cast, they're not winning the Big Ten. Wednesday's loss at Rec Hall proved that. They're nowhere near the bubble. I think we might see some experiments from Brad Underwood in these last 4 games before the Big Ten tournament. I mean, you're probably going to win at least 2 of them, and you've already had your high-profile wins. So as much as these games do matter, I think Brad Underwood might try and do some things differently, because it's just really hard to win games when you are giving up so many points. We see it all the time in the tournament. High-profile offenses with really bad defenses are easy to pick off. But hopefully Illinois can turn something around. There's 4 games left. Usually teams are what they are at this point in the year, but we're going to have to see. Joe, they did bounce back against Iowa, but earlier in the week, Iowa picked up a victory at the Breslin Center, which temporarily put them back in the picture. We're going to talk about the team that they beat there. Michigan State has lost back-to-back home games one to Iowa, and then one just a couple hours ago to Ohio State. Tough week for the Spartans. What were your thoughts? Did we lose you?
All right, Sean, I got you now.
Okay.
Sean, do I have you now?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
All right, perfect.
All right. Tell us about
Okay,
Michigan
good.
State.
Sean, it's relatively disturbing that at the beginning of the year, and we talked about the high expectations, but they were even harped by Tom Izzo. This is probably as problems they've had at the 5 position, and we've talked about it all year. I think the last 2 games, including today's collapse against Ohio State, which we'll get into, um, that's a blatant indictment on him. Seeing Owen Freeman, and he's been pretty good all year, but to make him look like practically an All-American is pretty inexcusable. And Iowa's transition offense, often known for being one of the best in college basketball, the fact that Michigan State looked like they hadn't seen anything like that is, at home, is pretty embarrassing. And I think the fans feel that way too. And all the goodwill I think they built up after that 3-game win streak against Illinois, Penn State, and Michigan, I think it's safe to say that's gone. And it's not only gone for most of college basketball, it's definitely gone in their fan base. And I'm not saying people were calling for Izzo's head. It's not even close to that. People were calling, though, for some wholesale changes. And, we'll talk about that. We'll talk about that at the end of the year. But, Sean, the fact that the season has gone pretty close to going somewhat off the rails is really bad. What's your take?
Yeah, they're now in a spot where they're gonna get into the tournament because of 1 or 2 games, and we tried to emphasize how important they were. That would be the Baylor win and the Illinois win, but now they're hanging on to those. They were around the bubble. They might have got in without it. Now they're hanging on to those. They have a week off, or 6 days before they head to Mackey on Saturday. They host Northwestern, and then they go to Assembly Hall to end the year. I mean, they could lose all 3 of those games. Joe.
And Sean, I got to ask you this because, we didn't even bother saying that they were on the bubble on the last cast because this was prior to them losing to Iowa and Ohio State, which I don't want to speak for you, Sean, but I can assume we probably thought they were winning both these games somewhat handily. I probably would have picked them to cover if I bet on them against Iowa, which they were picked to cover by like 9. So where does that put them, Sean?
Now, I will be doing a projection tomorrow. It was a pretty good weekend from the bubble teams. Just looking at their wins and losses, you had Wake Forest, you beat Duke. You had Gonzaga picking up a win against Santa Clara. You had Seton Hall beating Butler. I can go down the list. We'll see how those numbers shake out. But I think at the least, Joe, I think they're going to be in the mishmash of the 9-10 range, if I had to guess right now. And that, is not really where you want to be. Especially when, they had cleared the mishmash of 8, 9, 10 teams. They had the 7 seed. And, they dropped 2 games at home where they should have won, and somebody up the tower, because you might have to ring the bell soon.
Yeah, Sean, and to end with this, their last 3 games at Purdue, home against Northwestern, who is a tournament team, and at Indiana, including the Big Ten tournament, how many games do they probably have to win to feel really safe?
It probably depends who you beat, but three will be fine, and 2 would probably be enough. Because none of those losses are really bad, but got to win games. You're 17-11.
And Sean, assuming they lose to Purdue at Mackey, which I think is a fair presumption based on everything we've seen, 17-12. If they only beat Northwestern and lose to Indiana, do they go into the Big Ten tournament having to win at least 1 game?
Probably. So you see 17-12, 18-13 going into the Big Ten tournament. You don't want to be 18-14. Well, I'll say that.
Frankly, Sean, you can't be 17-14. That's what Michigan was last year, with a pretty similar resume, except Michigan had the 1 bad loss. Michigan State doesn't. But regardless, Sean, Michigan State has to pick up 2 more wins, in my opinion, for the rest of the year.
At least. And it probably depends on who those are against. But really, Joe, all three of their games the rest of the year would be considered pretty solid wins. I know Indiana's a team outside the top 100, but they have not gone to Assembly Hall and won since the first year of Archie Miller, if I had to guess, off the top
That's
of my
6 years
head.
ago. Yeah.
So, um, yeah, that would be my guess. And it's time to think about panicking. Not time to panic, but it's time to think about the fact that you might have to panic if you're Michigan State. Joe, we'll get to a. Let's talk about Ohio State. Second big win of the week, plus of Jake Diebler's time in charge in Columbus. Now, we've heard tons of rumors about who is interested in that Ohio State job. You lose at the barn, but you battle pretty hard. What's your take on this? Are you happy for the players? Is you taking this as a negative on Chris Holtmann? You think Jake Diebler might get some consideration?
I think he'd have to get at least some. I mean, they've played amazing. And I've often said, and you've often said, this is a great roster. It really is. You got scoring. You do have length. You have Akpara, and I know Zedke's not your traditional big man, but he's a solid enough big guy in this conference. I find it hard pressed unless you're Purdue. I'd be pretty shocked if you wouldn't want this guy on your team. So, all that said, Sean, I think it's a small indictment on Chris Holtmann that he didn't have these guys playing together like this, because this is a well constructed roster. It might have just needed a remix on how the message has been put across. Because even in their loss to Minnesota, they were in that game most of the time, and Minnesota winning at the barn hasn't been easy for teams this year. So the fact they competed in that game, and really have three solid performances in a row, solid, like, and that's being probably pretty harsh. I think they've had three good performances in a row, Sean. So, um, I think the fact he is a Buckeye too gives him some consideration. Um, uh, he's going to have to interview well and probably show, maybe win one or two in the Big Ten tournament. I think he's built up enough goodwill to at least stay on the staff there. But Ohio native, Buckeye at heart. So gonna be shocked if he's not there next year, not as a head coach, but at least in the program directly. But Sean, let's get into some of the rumors.
Yeah, so I don't really know when this or how this happened, Joe, but in more than one spot, there were rumors that Dusty May has been contacted by the Ohio State Athletic Department. He's the Florida Atlantic coach who took them to the Final Four last year. Certainly was expected to be, amidst the candidates. They took a tough loss to Memphis today, but that's beside the point. And the other name that has been linked with the job and somebody that is nearby is Sean Miller down at Xavier. Those two, to me, seem like that they're going to be Ohio State's first calls. And at this point, we really have only rumors to go off of. But would you be surprised if it ends up being someone else other than those two?
Um, I'd be pretty surprised if it was Dusty May. I think Ohio State definitely has a chance. I will say this. There's a very good chance Ohio State puts a very lucrative offer to Dusty May. And it's not just monetarily. I bet you they'll play with NIL, playing with whatever he wants to do. I think, he's going to be pretty demanding. He's probably the hottest coaching candidate out there. Midwest guy, too. So with all that into consideration, Sean, I would say I'd be pretty shocked if it's not Diebler, Miller, or May. Um, I think more candidates are going to be interested. I think they'll probably bring a few people in. It wouldn't shock me if they tried to get a hold of TJ Otzelberger. I doubt he would take the job, but I think getting a hold of him too, they're going to have to. When you have a search committee like this at The Ohio State University, they're not just going to call one or two guys. They're going to call probably five, but those will be the first two calls. And I'd be shocked if both May and Miller turned it down, especially a guy like Miller who's familiar with Ohio, had a big-time job in Arizona, thought he did pretty good. I know he didn't go to a Final Four, and I know he underperformed in a lot of tournaments, but what better chance to redeem yourself and get good recruits than at Ohio State? So,
yeah, Miller's definitely the front runner from what I've heard right now in what's been made public information. Dusty May, apparently had offers on the table after last year, pretty much returned his entire team. And now most of them are eligible to return for another year. So if Dusty doesn't like the offers that he's getting, he could, he could definitely stay at Florida Atlantic for another year. They're not in a league that is strictly a one bid league like they were last year. They're gonna be in the tournament this year as an at-large, if needed. They're gonna be a top 7 seed most likely. So I wouldn't totally rule out Dusty staying in Boca Raton at this point, but he'll at least answer the phone if Ohio State's calling, which it's pretty clear that they will or already have. Now, Joe, we're going to talk about 2 other teams that may have a vacancy sooner than expected. And unfortunately, Joe, it's the 2 teams that we support. First, we'll talk about my Indiana Hoosiers. This season has gone off the rails kind of quickly. You've lost a bunch of home games in a row. You got swept by Penn State. You're sitting at 6-10 and 13th place in the conference. I'll ask you this first. Do you think they'll move on from Mike Woodson?
I lean on no. I think, as we talked about at the end of last season, Sean, his first year, it was just about getting them back into the tournament. He did do that. Second year, I think they were really good not really good, but they definitely took a step up. I know they lost the round of 32, but they lost to a good Miami team. Let's face it. Miami went to the Final Four, and this year was always going to be, I think, a step down, but people would have hoped it would have been a step down making the tournament. And there's the clip that we have on TikTok and on our Instagram reels of you saying how they missed the tournament would be important if they did, right? Like, would it be beating some teams or losing to bad teams or just being completely discombobulated? Unfortunately, it's been the latter. So I think they might make him do and I'm going to save the analogy I'm going to use for our next conversation, Sean, but they're going to make him make some pretty big changes. It'd be hard to imagine if they didn't. And I'd be shocked if Indiana, and they did it this offseason too, but I bet you they attacked that portal pretty seriously. And Sean, I would be pretty surprised if they did to a guy like Mike Woodson. I'll be honest, if his name wasn't Mike Woodson and he didn't have the pedigree he did at Indiana, I bet you they would be pretty aggressive in moving on. Like, had this been Archie Miller in his 3rd year, they might have. So, but Sean, you're the resident Hoosier. Let's hear it from you.
Trilly Donovan on Twitter, it's a anonymous person who has a ton of information, has said Indiana has gone from he's definitely safe to we're going to have some conversations about it. So I think, I'd still be shocked. I mean, you got a McDonald's All-American coming in. You've likely got multiple starters returning. You have a lottery pick this year. Like, individually, I don't think that Mike Woodson is a bad coach. In fact, every player has gotten better since he started over the course of the season, and individually he sent 3 players to the NBA. Like, it's going to be 4 with Khalil Ware, and there might be some more players on this roster who end up making the league. But the manner of this, Joe, is just really, really surprising. 3 straight losses by double digits at home. You've been super uncompetitive in most of your losses. It's not like you playing close games and you lose them. They're not in the top 100 in the analytics, and that is worse than every team since Tom Crean started in Indiana and had limited scholarships, which, it's remarkable that he won, 6 and 10 games some of those years, but the style is ugly. It was last year, even when they were winning games. And we talked about it before the season, Joe. We had another clip that said how Indiana's offense operates without TJD will be how they go this year. Now, currently, they're 116th in offensive efficiency. Now, that is really bad. They're 109 in defense, too, which is also really bad. And it's not like, you missed out. You're a 1 seed in the NIT. You just missed out. And if a couple of possessions and a couple games went differently, you'd be in the tournament. I think you can make that argument for a couple of those Archie Miller teams. They hung around. They rarely got blew out. They won big games at home. They were very close a couple of times. They would have made the tournament in the COVID year. They were the first team out of the tournament the year before that. So that's not the case here. This team is Joe just 3 spots better than your Michigan Wolverines, who are 8-20. On a possession-by-possession basis, our teams are essentially the same. And Indiana got lucky that they were winning close games early. The results are starting to catch up with the numbers. And unfortunately, that's what happens. Analytics get things right over the course of the season, usually. That's why they're there, and that's why people trust them. But, people are talking about candidates. I would be shocked if he doesn't get a 4th year. I do think they'll switch up the assistants, maybe get somebody in there who's a little better with X's and O's, because Dane Fife was the associate head coach the first year, Joe. He was the associate to Tom Izzo for almost 10 years. They were a top 25 defense with 2 pretty bad defenders in the starting lineup. Dane Fife leaves, defense gets worse, offense gets worse. I think the route that they'll go is find a new staff. And then after that, if Woodson does make the tournament next year, I think they'll move on. But, Joe, we'll move the conversation over to your team if you don't have anything to add on the Hoosiers.
One last comment I make. I think the fact Indiana's not been to the Sweet 16 since 2013 is a disgrace. And it's not only a disgrace to, Indiana basketball itself, it's a disgrace to the fan base. They pack that place every night. The passion for Hoosier basketball is so strong, even in this down period they've had. So the fact that's been, not since 2013, I'm sorry, 2016, yeah. My apologies. Still
North Carolina,
Yeah, still way too long. And really, probably not in that. 2013 was really the only year in our, conscious lifetimes. We're both 22 and 23, where they've been national title contenders. And that's got to change. That's completely unacceptable. But Sean.
The way that you get marked success, Joe, is you make it every year. One of the times you'll go on a run, you'll get good matchups, you'll get the luck of the draw. If you make it 2 out of every 5 years, chances are you get lucky and break off a run is lower. And we have not seen it. The Hoosiers were a 5 seed that year when they made the Sweet 16, despite being Big Ten champions. They were a 4 seed last year. And then other than that, they have not been a favored seed in the first round since they were the number 1 seed in 2013. So you had some 10 seeds in there. You had a first 4, 12 seed in there. So, you would think Indiana those would be the down years, and those are kind of the middle years at this point. So hopefully things are going up for the Hoosiers. If you watch the Indiana women's team, you know that the program is not hurting for interest. They sold out Assembly Hall, which is 17,000 plus, multiple times for the women this year, and they just punked Caitlin Clark in Iowa. So the Hoosier fans at least get to cheer for that. Now, Joe, we're going to go over to your program, the team that I mentioned earlier, the Michigan Wolverines, 8-20 on the year. They hung around with the Big Ten's best team today, ultimately came up short. I don't know if we talked about it on here, but Olivier Nkamwa is out for the year. That's going to be his college career. Juwan Howard has had an incredibly up and down year with mostly downs. He had the surgery in July on his heart. Phil Martelli stepped in. You had the incident with the trainer. Sort us through this whole Michigan season and whether somebody else might be at the helm next year.
Sean, I've often defended... I've not defended Juwan wholeheartedly because a lot of this is on him. I've often blamed Warren Manuel and the administration at Michigan. I still stand strong in doing that. Last year, to be fair to them, they were handicapped by the fact they didn't have Terrence Shannon, who did commit to Michigan. Regardless, they had 2 top 15 guys in an All-American, and they couldn't make the tournament because they couldn't close out games. And last year, I'd say they were, honest to God, Sean, I think they were good last year. I really do. The record doesn't indicate that. They didn't make the tournament, but they were a good team offensively. And they were in almost every game they were in. Every game they played last year, with the exception of Penn State, they competed pretty hard. So this year, to see what's happened with no All-Americans, and frankly, Doug McDaniel and Olivier Calvin-Tives were the only players that looked like Big Ten starters. Everyone else on this team, and Terrence Williams stepped it up too. The lack of any bench presence, the lack of any interest in this is
Cutting out for a little bit, but I think you're back.
okay. I know. I think a lot of other factors at the university too have contributed to this, the success of the football and hockey team, but the success of other programs, and letting Purdue, Michigan State, take over your home arenas is a joke. The loudest Chrysler was this year was today, and it wasn't the home fans popping. It was to see the lack of interest in the program, confidence in the program. So, with all that said, Sean, they they're gonna have these done as the age do absolutely nothing, and that's not an option at this point. I'm not saying he has to fire Jawad. I think a lot of the fan base wants that, and frankly, if it happens, I'm not going to be upset at all. But he has to do something, whether that's helping Jawad attack the portal, letting some of these guidelines go, whether it's making him like change a whole staff, which is what he did with Jim Harbaugh. But here's the one difference between him and Jim Harbaugh. Jim Harbaugh in 2020, after that terrible 2-4 season, you know what Jim Harbaugh has that Jawad doesn't, Sean?
A lot. But where are you going with this?
Jim Harbaugh had 10 years as a head coach where he was extremely successful at Stanford and the 49ers. You were willing to say, hey, I'm going to gamble on you because you showed in the past you could do that. And it's not Jawad's fault he does not have that. All we've seen of Jawad since they lost to Villanova in the Sweet 16 has just been collapse after collapse in close games in the biggest moments. And frankly, a team that I don't think goes out there and puts 1,000%. So to see that and to see the fans' lack of interest in the game, that's what did Brady Hoke in. When the big house wasn't filled at the end of his tenure in 2014, that's what really did him in to me. Because Michigan hates firing coaches, especially ones who are Michigan men. That's our big thing. He's a Michigan man, right? This is going to force Ward Manuel's hand to do something. But if you make me gamble on it, I think both of them are gonna try to find a way to part ways because they won't fire Jawan. So that's my long-winded answer of saying unless he steps down, he will be back next year. Which I'll save that for the offseason. What are your thoughts, Sean?
Yeah, the stadium part is the most, interesting part of it to me because we talked about it earlier. Assembly Hall is still full for the Hoosiers when they're bad, which is this year. I mean, there's some bad pictures, Joe, of Chrysler Center right before tip-off in various games. Now, today, the blue and gold drove up from West Lafayette and showed out. Good for them. But that cannot happen.
No.
West Lafayette is not an hour away from Ann Arbor. That is, 4 or 5 hour drive?
It's 5 and closer to 6, and I'm willing to believe that a lot of those fans came from the even more west part of Indiana, so not helping the case.
Yes, so it's not like it was a Seton Hall versus St. John's type thing, but that's, and especially I think the success of other teams should build on the teams, not draw away. They're not playing at the same time at home. They're not, hockey also plays in the Chrysler Center, right?
No, they play at Yost, but they play on Friday nights at 7. I'm hard-pressed to find any Michigan games that start at 7. They had one game, intersect on campus this year, and that's when they lost to Long Beach. So don't tell me Michigan playing Penn State in hockey is why you lost to Long Beach State. Give me a break.
So, and something also struck a chord with me, Joe, was during the Purdue game today, CBS put Juwan's record over the years on the screen. Now, he's actually had pretty good March success, considering he's pretty much had one team that was not a bubble team or worse. They made the Sweet 16 as the 11th seed. They won ball games close to the bubble, but that outside of that Big Ten championship team, Michigan has not been better than a bubble team in his time there, which is, obviously I remember those, but looking at it all at once, I'm like, wow. A little bit shocking when you look back at it.
Yeah, and for all the Michigan fans who like to insult Ryan Day and say he was born on third base, John Beilein was a top 10 coach in college basketball. And sure, Jordan Poole wasn't on his first team. He had Isaiah Livers, Eli Brooks, Xavier Simpson, John Teskey, um, and pretty much he had Franz Wagner committed, wrapped up. Now, I'll give Jawan credit for getting him to the league, as will I give him credit for getting guys like Livers, Houston, Diabate, Jet, and Kobe to the league. But with all that talent, and you did next to nothing in 2022, 23. And frankly, 21, 22, they were lucky to be in the tournament and go on that run. I'll give them credit for that. But that team was kind of reminds me of Michigan State this year, Sean. That team in 21, 22 was supposed to be a Final Four contender team, and they didn't play like it until March. So,
when you think about that team, Joe, it's great that you made the Sweet 16, but you could have been one game away from being in the NIT.
Absolutely.
And that, judging coaches on their March success or failures is a little bit risky in that regard. Andy Enfield made the Sweet 16 with Florida Gulf Coast. He got the USC job out of it. Had a couple good teams there, but not really. So, judging Juwan on his March success might not be the way to go.
No, I think based on everything we've seen this year, it's not the way to go. Sean, I told you off air last week that I think Ward Manuel will keep Jawan. I think it will take Jawan or the school parting ways with him to do it because I think the Michigan administration right now is very hesitant to act. And I'm not just going to go on this limb saying it's because they're lazy. I think they're too conservative. And the fact that Harbaugh, I think the biggest consequence of Jim Harbaugh's success in the last 3 years is it's going to carry over to Michigan athletics that, hey, you could have one bad year. If you refix yourself and reinvent yourself and do what Michigan football did in 2021, all is going to be okay. And we see that happen in college football. A lot of coaches who've underperformed have not been let go. Even Chip Kelly, when frankly he was looking for a way out, and he eventually found his way out. But that kind of thinking is very dangerous. It's high risk, high reward. And when it doesn't work out, the results could be catastrophic. But I think I've written enough about Michigan basketball's coaching and athletic administration for now.
Yeah, so we're just going to have to lock into the teams that are going to make it. And, usually Big Ten teams should root for other Big Ten teams in the tournament. Maybe if it's not your rival, but still. You want to be respected by the committee. And, it would be bad for the conference if Purdue does bow out early again. It would be funny for an Indiana fan, but it would be bad for the health of this conference. Getting larger next year. We'll talk about all that in the offseason, but Joe, it's a lot of basketball here and not a lot of time before the champion cuts down the nets in Phoenix. So, Joe, one last thing before we wrap it up. Big Ten Coach of the Year. Who's your pick?
Honestly, Sean, it's going to be the guy that's had less incidents and maybe not a ton of expectation, but who wasn't necessarily undercounted either. I'm going to go with Chris Collins. I think Mike Rhodes, if someone told me that, I would tend to hear the argument, but at 13 and 14 now, I know they've had some really big wins. It's got to be a guy that's gotten his team into the tournament. I think Greg Gard was probably my earliest candidate till January, till Wisconsin started to collapse. But Northwestern, even with all the injuries they've had of recent, they've just found ways to win games. And not that beating Michigan's relatively hard, but Northwestern's not made consecutive tournaments ever, Sean.
They haven't had 10 wins they haven't had a 500 record or better in the Big Ten in consecutive seasons ever. And they have now.
And Chris Collins, like I said, I complain about Michigan's transfer standards and academic standards. Northwestern's had to deal with that forever, and he's done a remarkable job. The fact he was on the hot seat going into last year, I think in hindsight, all the people who said that and who believed that look pretty stupid right now. So I'm gonna go with Chris Collins, and I don't think even if they lose out, Sean, that wouldn't do anything to change my mind. What do you say?
It's either Hoiberg or Collins, and it probably depends on what happens the rest of the way. I would lean towards Hoiberg right now. They got their away win against Indiana. They're going to make the tournament. We talked about it being a possibility and they get the job done. They got a pretty versatile roster, and we've always believed Fred Hoiberg was a good coach, even if we're old enough to remember when he was the head coach at Iowa State. The X's and O's were never an issue for him. It was about getting good players in the door there. Now he's done that. Now he's got them in the tournament. So my pick is Hoiberg, but Collins right behind him before probably Painter and,
maybe Underwood.
Maybe Ben Johnson too. But
yeah,
we'll get to our conference teams later. It'll be a conference team / Big Ten tournament preview episode when it's time for that, Joe. And that's not too far away. Just 2 more weekends of games. And then we're going to be filling out our brackets. So a little longer episode today, but thank you everybody for tuning in to the In a Nutshell podcast. Mike and I will be on tomorrow for our Sports Daily College Basketball podcast. Thank you for listening. Be sure to like and